So I preached through the book of Ephesians my first year at the Village, and then since then have done a pretty good bit of study in 1st and 2nd Timothy, and then as we were talking just the other night, I've begun to really dig into 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, primarily 1st John, and then have preached at the Village Revelation, the letters to the churches. And so I'm kind of, it's funny how all those things, just about a year ago, I started going, wait a minute, this is all the same, like they're all talking about the same group. And so that's when I started looking at, okay, what's the lesson here to learn as a pastor who intends, if God allows him, to be in one place for his life? What do you have to watch out for and what do you have to guard? And I was surprised at what I found.
Well, I was gonna say, I mean, yes, wanting to build a church. I love that picture, what you were just describing, that does not forsake first love. And so a church building a culture of belief and confession. So how do you guys do that in a healthy way? Because I know even the context I stepped into had done this unhealthily. So how do we do this healthy?
I can tell you what we've done that's worked, and I think you'll have to, every place is a little bit different. And I know I want to be honest about where I have struggles, where I wrestle with texts, where I want to be honest about my past. I want to be honest about, so like even in the illustration of, let me show you just a little way where my heart's wicked, or be honest when I'm talking about parenting as a parent of 3 small children, that I have to ask my kids for forgiveness often. Like I have to go into the rooms and say, sorry, Daddy needs Jesus just as much as you need Jesus. And I've got to go do that. And I want to say that to them because they have a tendency, and people in general have a tendency to go, oh man, you're so awesome. And I want to go, no, I'm really not. I'm doing all that I can by the grace of God to be obedient to God, but I fall short constantly. I want to say, hey, Lauren and I, if it's there, I want to say, hey, man, Lauren and I did have a fight. We did disagree on this. There have been several instances in my marriage. So I'm from an abusive background. Lauren's from a externally religious background. Well, you put those two in a house together, there's going to be some issues. And so early in our marriage, man, we had hit some places where we didn't know how to get past them and went and got help. And so often when we've talked about marriage and we've talked about those things, I've been honest. I'm like, listen, I love Jesus very much. My wife loves Jesus very much, man. We couldn't figure this out. We had to go get help. And so I found by me being open and honest about my own shortcomings and own failures, and legitimate ones, not like I love my wife so much, or I think maybe I love my kids too much. I think I support them too much. I think I pray with them too much. Instead of that kind of weird thing that happens, I want to be real honest about this is where I am, this is what I've struggled with. Here's what I've struggled with historically. So some of that was in today. And then the other thing I think we've done well is we'll show very often, in fact there's one this weekend, we'll show a 3-minute testimony video. We very rarely go live mic anymore just because that tends to go long and sometimes badly. And so, but we'll capture a 3-minute testimony of, this is what Christ has done in my life. This is how he brought me to the Village. This is how he's worked in my heart. And some of it's, I'll be straight, some of it's PG-13. There have been times I've had to stand up and say, hey, some of the things that are in this testimony are, they're very raw. So you either want to earmuff your kid or just head out for a second lest you get caught in conversations you don't want to have. And then the third thing that we've done really well is when we do baptisms, the pastors rarely baptize. We baptize those that we are a part of leading to Christ. But if you win your friend to Christ, you baptize your friend at the Village, okay? And so what ends up happening in that moment is not only does the person who received Christ give their testimony, all right, out of religion or irreligion, but the person who shared the gospel also gets to share their testimony of being afraid almost every time, being nervous and afraid to go next door, to walk into the office next to theirs, or to invite. And so you get this constant stream of testimonies in the life of your church that often is very raw and very gritty and calls people back to, it calls the guy in the church that's secretly battling with porn as he has for a decade, hear a guy say, this has been my life, this has been my darkness, here's how Christ has conquered it, overcome it, and why I'm able to walk in freedom now because of it. And now he's going, did that just get said from the stage? I mean, did somebody just say that? Nobody gasped, nobody freaked out, and so I think you have to work over a period of time at creating that culture, creating that environment. That's some of the ways that we've done it.
Damini? Well, I was really interested in the question that David was starting to raise about preaching and style and personality and those things. I know you guys have had some conversation. David, I don't know if you want to ask that question.
Yeah, sure. I've listened to these guys have conversation. I think I've had probably more conversations just in time with Mark, but I've heard both these guys talk about, and I think you've seen different style of preaching all across the five of us, and how do we approach style with our personality? There are some who would say, preach totally just as you are. Even this deals with use of humor, which obviously, Matt, we were joking around the tweetable comments that were in our time today.
None of which were the godly.
Right. No. It was very gospel-centered. If you leave a fight without your pants, then you have lost.
But that is true.
Yes, it is true. It is true. So anyway, I have said enough. What do you guys think about humor in preaching, personality in preaching? You guys have had this discussion. What are your thoughts on how to best approach that with all of our uniqueness, particularly in this room?
Well, I'm a little reluctant. I'm a little reluctant to talk about this in public because it's so easy to do one or other things, neither of which I want to advocate. One, just to say humor is great. You should use it as much as possible. I'm going to go home tomorrow and try to do what Matt did today. That's probably not a good idea. Or on the other hand, humor is wrong when you're preaching the gospel. And you quote Richard Baxter, I preach a dying man to dying men, and therefore reason from that you never want to use humor. I think both of those things would not be right. Matt is really gifted, just naturally, obviously, at being able to be humorous in person, and because he, at least apparently, are comfortable in front of people, then doing the same thing in front of people. But I've seen Matt preach a number of times, and I think, I don't know if I would say 100%, but generally, I've seen him use his humor in pretty, innocuous ways, in ways to bring people in, kind of like you were doing last night, David. Because I think you and I talked a little bit about, Sennacherib and those 185,000. So, and even in the way you read that text in Isaiah 36:37, you elicited, and you clearly intended to elicit a humorous response from people. I think part of that for us as public speakers is quite natural, because that's how we know they're hearing us, we know they're understanding. We pulled them over. Jesus, in some of the parables, he must have gotten a laugh with, not all of them by any means, but just certainly with some of those. Yeah. He must have. So I certainly don't want to take the absolutely you don't do humor. But I guess I would say, compared to the way, if you're looking at a dead church, then what they need is the gospel, and the gospel that they're going to have can be presented, must be presented with passion, and some of that can involve humor. But I think the tendency today, particularly among young people, and this conference is hugely skewed to the young, I think, as it was last year. The tendency of this generation is going to be, I fear, too much to humor and to be too critical of a lack of use of humor. Yeah. So I think the easier error to make these days is to let our inner sarcasm, and I by nature sadly am very sarcastic, but it's to let that sarcasm come out too much in our preaching, or to not be thoughtful about how we do it. Isaiah clearly shows us that God is sarcastic sometimes. I don't think sarcasm is by its nature wrong, but I think we have to be very careful. So I want to take neither the humor's always wrong approach, nor the big green light, hey, go and try to be sort of as funny as you can. That lets down their defenses, then bring them in. I may have just qualified it so much I didn't say anything.
No, I think it's good. I think there's need for balance.
No, you definitely did. Matt?
Yeah, he did. He just kind of talked and never answered. But but that's fair. It happens.
He lives in D.C.
I would say
that was funny.
I would say I thought so.
Good humor.
Well, they didn't think so. This is why you don't want to go home and try it. See,
to me, I think it always goes back to the heart, because this was an issue that created a great deal of sorrow in me for a long time. When you sit down and you read Supremacy of God in Preaching, and Piper's pointing towards Edwards and saying there wasn't a joke in any of his manuscripts. And so I kind of go, hey, there's not a joke in mine. I mean, I've got 4 pages right here. There's not a, hey, say something dumb about this here, or there's no written out illustration of, there's nothing about pants. There's nothing about, those things just, they have to be guarded in me. But I think what I always want to come back to is, what's the heart of the preacher? And so that's the question that I need answered in me. That's the question I need answered in a young guy that's at the Village that wants to be a preacher. So am I trying to use humor so that you'll like me and accept me? If so, I think, if your opening illustration is, ooh, they're gonna laugh and I'm gonna feel comfortable and then I can get to work, then I think you're using a crutch that you shouldn't be using. You need to trust the text. So I think those are the kind of questions that you have to kind of dig into when it comes to humor. Is this just me? Is this who I am? And how much of this do I need to stand on now to make sure that the message gets heard? Because the irony is, and my good friend Josh Patterson and I have talked about this at length, if anyone ever knew what was actually happening up here, then I'm going, oh, no, never. That would never, I cannot do that. We are not going there, all right? And if anybody knew what was filtered before what actually came out, they would go, Chandler's nailing it. Chandler's a serious man. And so I think that's the question. The question is the heart of the preacher. Does he trust the text? Does he trust the power of the Holy Spirit moving through the text? Or is he trying to use his personality to supplement those things? If the answer is no, but rather I want to be who God's created me to be, where he's placed me to be, to make him known in this place, then I don't want to apologize for being Matt Chandler. I don't want to try to be John Piper. I don't want to try to be Jonathan Edwards. To be honest, I think dinner with Jonathan Edwards, I've heard guys go, that would be so awesome. I think it'd be the most awkward experience of my life. I think we'd just stare at each other. But he would talk, I wouldn't understand, he would judge me, I would go home feeling ashamed and repent, and that's how I think it would go. So, I love to read him. I don't know that I'd want to grab a drink with him. Maybe I would, Danny. I think you should emulate him.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, good.
Maybe not Spurgeon.
Maybe not Spurgeon, but Edwards. So, and that would be my take on it. So I think it's the heart of the preacher.
Well, you and Danny can go grab a drink afterwards and talk about it.
It wouldn't be awkward. Okay. It wouldn't be awkward at all.
The part of what you must do is judge it by the fruit. What are you seeing?
Sure.
Are you seeing in your congregation a kind of a lightness and a levity, and what they talk about and enjoy is the humor, and really the burden of your message, so today, the grace-centeredness of it, the gospel-centeredness of it, that's not getting across, that's not what they're paying attention to.
Well, and I think that's absolutely true. So I don't want to hear back a year later an illustration. I want to hear what the weight is behind it, what the truth was behind it, what we were trying to communicate. So,
what about your rose illustration?
Sure, but the rose illustration isn't that's so funny.
Oh, right, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's an illustration that's very aggressive and powerful. It's not so much the baby story, the baby's fat head story.
Yeah.
So if a year from now it's, oh man, how funny was that baby story, then I will have failed to communicate. If every time you see a kid trying to walk from now on, you think about God celebrating you in Christ, then we won.
That's a good way to do it.
I like the baby story for that very reason. That was a great illustration. I thought you illustrated very naturally and vividly. And so I was, as someone who doesn't feel like he illustrates very well at all, I was helped watching your preaching, learning from your preaching.
Dabidi, I know a lot of young preachers feel like they don't illustrate well. What do you do if you feel like you're a preacher who doesn't illustrate well?
Well, I think you work on it. I think you work on it by maybe finding a few models, a few guys who do that well. I think you maybe pay more careful attention to your own reading habits as well. So learn to read with illustration in mind. I enjoy reading fiction, partly because I think fiction, if it's good fiction, illustrates. And that just helps me. That opens me up a bit creatively. But mainly, I think watching preachers who do it well. Yeah.
Mark, I think almost all of us have strengths and weaknesses in our preaching. Yeah. Those who tend to be really good at illustrating my experience has been tend to be weaker in exposition because they can just carry a message with their ability to tell a story and say funny, creative things. So they have to force themselves. Now, I'm here to teach the text. I'm here to proclaim the Word. Those who really just naturally are comfortable in the Word, so like what Thabiti says, and I think I struggle in that area. When I first started preaching, my preaching professor was Paige Patterson. He told me, you work masterfully through the text. You don't illustrate very well. You don't apply very well. And I do think some of that's overcome as you get older, you live longer, you experience more life, and so that begins to help there. But for me, I have to consciously work at finding good, appropriate illustrations because that's not the way my mind naturally works. So I have to work harder in the areas of my deficiency and weakness, which is also a good thing because it keeps me humble, recognizing my dependence upon the Lord to take His Word and appropriately communicate it so that people hear it.
David, you have a famously intense sense of mission and the urgency of mission. And I know from brothers at your church and brothers who visited your church that it's communicated in and through your church. So what do you at Brook Hills do to capture what Matt's been talking to us about this morning, this center, this sense of grace-centeredness? It's okay to not be okay, but it's not okay to stay there. What are you doing as a pastor to inculcate that in the Church of Brook Hills?
I hope doing exactly what Matt has exhorted us to do. I hope that in the context of mission, we are constantly seeing the gospel as our foundation, that the only way, kind of the way we've talked about it, even in terms of some of the stuff that's been more public now, but the starting point of a radical life is a radical death to self, a radical death to any attempt to earn favor before God, to overcome guilt before God, that we must die to these things. And when we are resting in the righteousness of Christ, now we're free to give our lives in radical abandonment to Christ. And that this is the overflow of the gospel in us, that it's constantly motivating us, the grace-driven effort of that D.A. Carson talks about. Yes. And so, I want to plant every exhortation to mission solidly in the soil of gospel grace. And that's why I wanted to, even last night in Isaiah 6, kind of come back to that it's a high view of the God and humble view of the gospel that compels us to mission. Anything else is manipulative or guilt-ridden or this or that, and may work for a little while and may last for a little while, but will not endure the trials that will come in mission. And I have to be careful because I can, in putting major needs before our people, and in any context, to not play on guilt, but to say, here's the needs. These needs drive us to Christ. When we trust in Christ, when we believe in Him, even to use the language from Acts 19, then He will compel us and drive us out.
Last question that I can think of for this, and I know we're out of time, but Matt, I just wonder, since you're in the Bible Belt, do you find that you're in danger of leading your church into really just accepting that first half as the big statement against hypocrisy and legalism? It's okay to not be okay. And that's where the emotional energy is that's where the telling stories are and the punch in the gut to the legalists. And that, do you find that's the danger of becoming the attitude of the church, and then it's hard to push on to, but it's not okay to stay there, the kind of stuff maybe that David was more pushing us to?
I think there have been times at the church where we've started to recognize, hey, so an example would be we started feeling about a year ago, actually it's been more than a year ago now, that our people really understood the gospel well but didn't know how to actually walk in it day in and day out. And so we did a topical series just called The Path, where I just kind of walked through here's what it looks like to surrender to this and walk in this. And in Colossians, I want to get back to grace-driven effort and talk about the fact that this has implications. And here are those implications, because we don't want them swinging from legalism to license. And that's always my big concern for 20-somethings who have grown up in that fundamental, and I don't mean that in a good way, that kind of real tight fundamental upbringing, is they'll hear freedom and don't have the maturity to understand freedom's given so it can be laid down. And so they'll just sprint out and go, well, I'm able. And I think our questions constantly is, but should you? And so that we've had to do some of that, definitely.